Hello and thanks for joining us. This is News Central Television. You're watching Secure the Continent. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the security happenings on the continent. Before we delve into today's topic, let me bring you the latest security headlines across Africa. Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari condemns killing of one of two Catholic priests by kidnappers in the northern state of Kaduna. Amnesty International calls on Ethiopian authorities to launch an investigation in Oromia region, the killing of more than 400 people in Oromia region. Ethnic clashes in Sudan's Blue Nile state in a deadly land dispute have killed 105 people and wounded 291. And finally, military officials from Libya's rival eastern and western power bases call for a unified command over the troops. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Today on Secure the Continent, our focus is on African Union's standby force. After more than a decade of investment and development, the African Union declared the African standby force ready for rapid deployment in 2016. But the force has never seen any action. How effective and viable will they be? Can they match up to current security threats across the continent? We have more details for you in this package.
The African Standby Force is an international, continental African and multidisciplinary peacekeeping force with military, police and civilian contingents acting under the direction of the African Union. The ASF is to be deployed in times of crisis in Africa. The Constitutive Act gives the AU the right to intervene in a member state in grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. It is composed of multi-dimensional capabilities, including military, police, and civilian, who are on standby in their countries of origin and ready for rapid deployment. Remarkable progress has been achieved in recent years on a massively ambitious scheme to enable Africa play a greater role in and assume greater responsibility for continental conflict management. According to the 2022 Global Terrorism Index, Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for 48% of global terrorism deaths, with 4 of the 10 countries with the largest increases in deaths from terrorism coming from the region.
Now, joining me this evening live from Ghana is Matthew Topare, a security analyst, and pretty much later we'll have Adib Sani, a security analyst and executive director at Jatike Center for Human Security and Peace Building, will also be joining us from Ghana to discuss the ASF, African Security Force. Now, what's the genesis, Matthew? What are the origins and genesis of for the creation of the ASF?
All right, thank you so much for the opportunity. Good evening to your viewers across the globe. I think that the genesis of this AFF has been because of what we witnessed over the past years and decades in terms of the constant threat levels that we have actually witnessed in various African countries, in Somalia, if you think of Mali, and even beyond that. So I think the leaders of the continents have decided to actually find some solution which I consider to even be late. This is actually a late decision which we could have done in some 10, 15 years back, but never late than ever. We thought that having this particular thing done now will give us the opportunity to have much stronger, a lot of intellect when it comes to combining forces, combining intelligence, and trying to ensure that we have issues addressed. So the genesis has always been the past experience we had, and what can we do to have that addressed? And I think that is what led to this particular decision, which I think is a welcome decision.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Now, Matthew, the African Union Standby Force, the idea of it was mooted 20 years ago, and we've seen it come into fruition. What's the role and the mandate of the African Standby Force in African security architecture, if you look at it holistically?
Yes, I think that the role of this African Security Standby Force basically will have to do with monitoring the threat level within the continent. We have a lot of security-related issues within our continent, which we need to have a unified force which will have the ability in terms of logistics, which will have the ability in terms of technology, which will be able to combine these things in observing the threat level within the continent and ensuring that if there's any interference at all in terms of humanity, they should be able to step in, have a dialogue, find a way of having it resolved before it even escalates to a point where we may not want that to be. So, in fact, the whole idea of putting this together is to actually ensure that the continent in itself, in terms of security, we have a unified force in terms of we ensuring when you have a situation is for instance, in any of these countries where you have Somalia, you have Nigeria, you have Ghana, if there should be any emergency, then they should be able to step in and have that addressed. My fear, however, remains that whether we will be able to have this continue to firm up in terms of logistics, in terms of intellect, so we can match the crime, the current crime as we are moving. Because the crime now is indeed moving very fast.
And there are also conflicts popping up in different parts of the continent. And that's what leads me to this next question, Matthew. The African Union directed the African Standby Force has not been deployed since its establishment in 2003. This is despite the African Union's extensive experience with peace support operations in countries like Burundi, Sudan, Somalia, Mali, and the Central African Republic, to name a few. We've had deployments of African Union troops, AMISOM, and all of that. But why hasn't the African Union Standby Force been deployed?
Well, I think just as I mentioned earlier on, it's likely have to do with a lot of some of the challenges the African Union will have to do with logistics, with intelligence, it has to do with getting the right human resource in terms of putting this team together. I think the idea, the fact that they have the idea is actually not enough. But you really will need to engineer the whole idea by getting the right people, by getting the right technology, by getting how these teams can be formed together to be able to achieve the objective that we have conceived. And I think that is where the struggle is. The African unions have.
So they need to move beyond a brilliant idea on paper towards actualizing this goal of deployment of the African Standby Force. Now, Matthew, all of this that we've been talking about, it sounds like a huge logistical operation. Who's going to fund all of this?
That they may want to do.
Yes, I'm listening to you, Matthew.
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, it is for various reasons why this force is still not deployed. One could be technology, one could be funds, but I think to a large extent it would have to do with the key political parties, the key continent, the key leaders themselves. Did they really have an interest? Did they really know what they want to do? That's a big question for everybody else to be questioned. It's been long overdue, and we think that we should have had this thing done. And why it's not done is a critical form. Nothing it has to do with the will, the interest of having the right thing done. That is what is keeping us still not deployed.
Now, Matthew, while it has been declared operationally ready in 2016, key operationally ready, the African Standby Force, ASF, has not been deployed in its originally designed form. This is not for the lack of opportunities, because we see conflict popping up in different areas of the continent, but rather a demonstration of the power of the regional economic communities, the RECs, and the regional mechanisms, Africa's sub-regional security structures over matters of peace and security. Is this not a better approach to addressing security challenges across the country, across the entire continent? Because you've seen SAMIM, for example, the Southern African Development Community Intervention Force with the Rwandan Defense Forces operations in Mozambique, and they've been fairly successful. We've also seen AMISOM, we've seen the G5 Sahel in West Africa, and all of this regional blocks having their own small intervention forces. Is this not a better mechanism to taking care of security challenges on the continent, instead of having this huge behemoth that fails to take off because of its logistical nightmare and the red tapeism, the bureaucracy, and the entire size of it? What's your opinion on this? Hello, Matthew. Okay, I think we lost Matthew there. We hope to have him join us back soon. And also, during the course of the program, we'll be expecting Adib Sani, a security analyst, to also join us from the Ghanaian capital, Accra. You're watching Secure the Continent on News Central Television. We're discussing the African Standby Force. We'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion. Do stay with us. You're welcome back to Secure the Continent on News Central Television. I still have Matthew Torpare here, a security analyst, join us from Ghana. We're discussing the African Union Standby Force. When will it be operational, and when we'll see it deployed to trouble spots on the continent? Just before we went in that break, Matthew, I was telling you that since the African Union Standby Force was declared operationally ready in 2016, the ASF has not been deployed in its originally designed form. This is not because of lack of opportunities, but rather a lack of power, a demonstration of the power of regional economic communities, RECs, and regional mechanisms such as AMISOM, the G5 Sahel Group, ASMIN mission in Mozambique, the Rwanda Defense Forces, and the South African Development Community Forces intervention in Cabo Delgado, for example. They've performed brilliantly. So my question is this not a better approach to addressing the security challenges on the continent? Or do you think the African Union Standby Force would be a better way to address some of these issues? Because the regional economic blocks are already doing, a fairly good job.
That's true. I think you're right in that context. They are doing a good job. But the fact still remains that you cannot also undermine the effectiveness of this African, if we should have a standby force that would indeed, if you take, for instance, let me just give an example of NATO. If you see the operational principles of NATO, and the background and the whole idea of it, one would definitely not undermine the idea of the African Standby Force. Because the fact that we have other organizations who are able to, or other institutions or other platform that gives you the opportunity to express and address security issues, for me, is not to say that there's African Security Standby Force.
Hello, Matthew. Okay, we're still talking about the African Standby Force of the African Union that was established for Africa to find a solution to African problems before, instead of running to Europeans and other development partners to address these issues. Good to have you back, Matthew.
Yes, sorry. So I was just saying that the principle is almost the same. If you look at the idea of the standby force, I think it's important. Yes, we may have other platforms where it's there for African leaders, it's there for the African continent to secure our continent or express and resolve security issues. But I think that there's indeed a need for us to have this standby force, a unified force, a force with the right ability in terms of ensuring that any member of their country, once tempered with, can easily be stepped in and looked into to see what could be the cause and have it properly addressed. So yes, we may have other security platforms, we may have other issues where one will say why the African Union Security Standby Force. But of course, this for me, I think is a step in the right direction. It's something if we need to indeed have it operationalized, we need to try to find out, is it because some, maybe on quotes, African leaders might think that having this thing operationalizing might have some effect on their country, or maybe when it comes to internal security mechanisms, their interference. Could that be the reason? Aside that, I think that is a brilliant idea. I think it's something that everybody else needs to go in for. I would rather recommend also that we get the right thinking people, the right experience in terms of people who know why this has to be formed, and let's push for it. As Africans, we must solve our own problems. Mm-hmm. We should be able to, and I think we can do that.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I would like to use this opportunity to bring in Mr. Adib Sani, a security analyst and executive director at Jatike Center for Human Security and Peace Building. He also joins in from Ghana. Good to have you, Adib.
My pleasure, always.
Now, Adib, some of the established joint forces to fight terrorism in Africa include the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, ATMIS. We also have the Joint Multinational Force in the Lake Chad Basin, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, and the SADC mission in Mozambique, known as SAMIM. How will you rate the performances of these regional bloc's peacekeeping exercises, and does it give you an insight into the capabilities of how the African Standby Force will perform?
Okay, so like you rightly mentioned, we have quite a number of regional and sub-regional. For example, in West Africa, we have ECOMO under the auspices of ECOWAS. However, within the same sub-region, we have the G5 Sahel, MINUSMA, we have the Accra Initiative, the Joint Task Force, like you mentioned, and even operations such as Operation Bakan, which is constricted to some countries within the same area.
And Takuba.
I think
and the task Force Takuba.
Yes, Takuba and the rest. Okay, fine. So I think it is too splintered. And if we are not careful, it would lose its very relevance for which it was set up in the first place. Rather, the focus should be an umbrella, okay, to cover all countries as much as we can. Then perhaps that umbrella would have its divisions, rather than this group of countries coming out with theirs, that group of countries coming out with theirs. It doesn't help, because the fundamental issues of not having resources is there. The fact that countries are not willing to contribute money is also a legitimate issue. And also the fact that they go to the international stage append their signature to all sorts of documents, get back home, and because of local political dynamics, they simply just toss the document they signed into the bin in the first place.
Now,
so I think it is a great thing.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you there. I was just going to ask, because you said it's better for us to work in one framework, but is it not more effective if these countries work as sub-regional organizations and sub-regional bodies? Is it not easier to manage, and they seem to have a better understanding of the dynamics involved? When you look at language, for example, they have a more common culture than for you to have one big African standby force, which would take a lot of logistics. And as we speak, they said they will be deployed for operations since 2016, and it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so if we have a whole of Africa standby force like we do, it is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with it. But we should also have rather sub-regional standby forces like ECOWAS has with ECOMOC. SADC region would have theirs. The North Africans would have theirs. But they should, you see, they should work in a synergized manner with the whole of Africa unit. But my concern has got to do with the fact that all these bodies seem to be working in isolation and without recourse to the all-encompassing African standby force. And to make matters worse, even within the sub-regions, there are different groupings. And so there's no coordination, and that makes our fight, particularly against terrorism, much more complicated than we thought. And as a project manager, I mean, I don't believe in just things on the face value. I believe in outcome. The question is, despite all of these groups, to what extent have we been able to reduce the scourge of terrorism in Africa, particularly West Africa? We have seen terrorism grow by the day. Since the Grand Bassam was attacked in Ivory Coast in 2016, we have seen more and more attacks happen. For example, in 2019, there were no attacks in Ivory Coast, Benin, and in Togo. But just last year, there were 13 attacks in Ivory Coast, 5 attacks in Benin, and just 1 attack in Togo. This year, what are we seeing? The numbers is likely to triple or even quadruple. So despite the existence of all of these groups, if we have terrorism still growing, it can only mean one thing: it is not working.
Okay, thank you, Adib. That brings me to this question. You've raised some really cogent and poignant points that we need to look at. You have all these groups, all these groupings, and if you look at the trajectory and the timeline, terrorism seems to be getting worse. Burkina Faso, that used to be relatively peaceful, is now the epicenter of terrorism in the West African Sahel region. So my question to you, Matthew, is, as is so often the case with multilateral initiatives in sub-Saharan Africa, the issue is money. In May, the African Union said that it will need $1 billion to make this African standby force operational. It looks brilliant on paper, like Adib just said, and it would be nice for us to prefer African solutions to African problems, like you said earlier to Matthew. The ASF is a massive logistical operation that involves all the countries of the African Union. My question to you is, where does it seek to get its finances from to keep these operations going?
Well, thank you. I think just as my colleague Sani mentioned, yes, this is capital intensive, but it has to do with the will. If we have the willpower, I think we should be able to do this. It's probably just because of the local political dynamics. Different countries have their own wills. So they go, as he mentioned, they may have these things signed, but I believe strongly we are still at where we are because we don't believe that we can solve our own problems. We still have all these platforms, and yet we are having this terrorism increasing because this idea of African standby force, I think, is a very good idea. And I think that is what once we champion, getting the funds from the whole of our continent should not be a problem. We should have a way where we can say each country, for instance, should be able to have these contributions within this period of time. And if we have that understanding for leaders to actually commit and indeed begin to contribute, I don't think we need support from anybody. We should be able to organize ourselves financially, and whatever the amount may be, we should be able to get that and have this thing operationalized and have it unified and have it work for us. So Mr. Sani mentioned, and I think that we still have these problems here and there. We have it in Togo, it's increasing almost every now and then. It's because we really do not pay attention to it. We sign for documents, sometimes we don't even read. Our leaders sign for this, unfortunately, things they don't read. But I think that this whole idea is largely because we involve people who do not understand the whole dynamics of security and its effects. Because if a political leader go ahead to make these kind of promises and make a commitment, even without knowing the details and how you'll be able to have these things addressed, then we are likely to be at where we are. And I think that it's time we begin to make good use of experts, people who understand how these things work. Yes, leaders, political leaders will bring these things together. Yes, they may have the idea, but you need to involve the people, the human resource who really understands these things. And for the funds, I believe strongly, it's about the will. We can do. If we have the will, the African continent is big enough. The African continent is rich enough. We should be able to get the funds. We should be able to, even without getting it done from anybody, we should be able to have this operationalized. The only challenge is just the will. And I think that most African countries, they also sign for an agreement or a commitment without necessarily agreeing to it because they want to have their way, even if, for instance, if they want to remain in power forever. So if, for instance, you want to stand in for this and tomorrow you want to be in power forever, and the same African Union standby force steps in, the things you signed for, what happens? So these are the various dynamics I see to be the stumbling block against these whole things yet to be operationalized. I don't think it's the fund. We should be able to mobilize the fund.
Thank you, Matthew. I would like to take on Mr. Sani on this question of money. The African Union says it needs $1 billion for this African standby force to kick off. My question is this. We always talk about African solutions to African problems. So if we have donor assistance from foreign partners, because no country is an island, no continent is an island in the sense of it. Everything in this world is related, because if there's a refugee problem and if North Africa, for example, is unstable, like we've seen, it will lead to a migrant crisis, which will be part of Europe's problems. So are we allowed to seek for donor assistance from Western aid agencies, from Western countries, from America or from Asia, for example? Or would it compromise our stand of, looking for African solutions to African problems, Mr. Sani? How do we deal with this money problem?
For help from the donors. Almost every country in Africa has a military cooperation of some sort with a Western country. For example, in Ghana, we have the Defense Cooperation Agreement, which was signed somewhere in 2014 or so between the two countries, Ghana and the United States. And they are allowed to use our radio spectrum. They are allowed to use our airspace and even part of our airports for whatever activity it is. We've also seen a number of defense cooperations between the French and particularly French-speaking countries in West Africa. Operation Barkhane ended not too long ago. And for example, the Malians have decided that the French are not helping us. So let us look to the east. And today, what we have, the Wagner Group, live in action in Mali. And I think that the Burkinabes are also looking to that as well, because I picked up information and I even saw some of the videos after the coup, the last coup. A lot of Burkinabes came out in the streets holding Russian flag. So it is something that I'm pretty sure the military junta is also closely looking at. But a country like Ivory Coast has been very loyal to France, because we know the circumstance under which President Alassane Ouattara came into power in the first place, and how he was able to extend his rule beyond the second term.
Yes.
South Africa and so many other countries have cooperated. But the question is, to what end? And I think it is for the benefit of your viewers to understand that there is never a military solution to anything. This is not to posit that the standby force is our savior, is going to end all the insecurity. No. In security matters, you handle things using what they call the carrot and stick approach. In as much as you use force, you should also use dialogue, the other means, and that is addressing the human insecurities, which I must say is 90% of the problem.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sani. You're watching Secure the Continent here on News Central Television. We've been discussing the African Standby Force. How viable is it, and when will it become operational in order to deal with security threats all around the continent? We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation. You stay with us. You're welcome back to Secure the Continent here on News Central Television. We've been discussing the African Union Standby Force. How equipped is it to deal with the security challenges on the continent? And I still have you with me, Matthew Torpare and Adib Sani. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. Now, Matthew, the African Standby Force policy framework and the roadmap for the operationalization of the ASF called for the establishment of a rapid deployment capability, RDC, capable of intervening within 14 days in cases of genocide, gross human rights abuses under Scenario 6 of the framework. Does the ASF, as is currently constituted, have the rapid deployment capacity?
Well, sir, I am happy you mentioned capacity. In the industry of security, capacity is very important. And that is why I mentioned in my initial presentation that the whole thing is also centered on the technological ability. If we don't have the technological ability, it's just not a matter of having the force, deploying them within a certain period of time frame for them to go and have issues resolved. But I think we should have also the ability to detect, the ability to respond, the ability to even see far and swift in terms of, and all these things requires high technology when it comes to security. You require high technology to be able to detect, to be able to tell that this thing that is happening in this particular country, you will need this to be able to address this. Otherwise, this is what is going to happen. We're going to have a situation where you will deploy a force into a country to address an issue, and they will end up escalating the problem. Because if you don't use the right means, just as my colleague Sani mentioned, some of the cases you may need to use dialogue. Some of the cases you may need to use force. depending on whatever it is to be, depending on the magnitude and the force level in the issue at hand. If we don't have the right capacity in terms of technology, if we don't have the right and the capacity in terms of the human resource, the right people in terms of knowing what to do, we will have the force, you have the rapid deployment force ready, but we are likely to deploy them at a place.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I'd like to come to Mr. Sani. Sani, still talking about the rapid deployment force capabilities of the African Standby Force. This should be easier to bring together than a whole regional force. And we do know the importance of this, quick, timely interventions. If it was there in 1994, I'm sure the Rwandan genocide, for example, would have been prevented. Now, that's one arm of the question I'm asking you about. What will it take, and the importance of a rapid intervention force that can be deployed within 14 days under the framework. And also, I want to ask you about training of this African Standby Force. We have a lot of experience in peacekeeping operations. African countries are very generous, and a lot of them even use it as a source of revenue when, you know, African soldiers are participating in global peacekeeping operations. Who is going to train this African Standby Forces? Because they still need some form of training, like Matthew did say, before they're deployed to conflict zones and hotspots.
Absolutely. Training is key. And most of it would have to perhaps even come from outside the continents. I'm pretty sure the US is always ready and willing to support in that regard because it's in their interest as well. That is why they have military bases all over the world, including Camp Lemonia and the rest, because they have to fight the war on terror preemptively. Because whatever happens,
Sani,
for example...
allow me to jump in here. So when you have a situation where funding comes from Western countries, you also have training from the West. Can we still call it an African Standby Force? Is it still an African solution in the sense of it?
Okay, we have to own it. We have to lead it. But we cannot be an island. There's always the need for military cooperation. The US spends hundreds of millions of dollars in improving the Egyptian military every single year and other militaries. As for Israel, President Biden has even almost doubled what they are due, you know, on an annual basis. So we need that support. They have the advanced technology, like Matthew rightly mentioned. We need technology. We need the F-16 fighter jets. We perhaps even need the F-22 Raptors. We need the drone technology to be able to go after these terrorists. For example, in Nigeria, Boko Haram is engaged in what we call an asymmetrical warfare situation, and that is everybody's nightmare. These are not two armies meeting head on and fighting. One hits and runs. And that is why America couldn't defeat the Viet Cong between 1965 and 75, because they hit and run. And so Boko Haram, they hit and run into the Tambisi forest. How do you chase them? But with the right technology, satellite technology, drone technology, we should be able to know where exactly in the forest they are coming from and go after them there, okay? So we need that cooperation from the US, but it doesn't really mean that we are selling our sovereignty to them, and because they also have a lot to benefit from in that regard. Indeed, if we had a standby force, like you rightly mentioned, we would have prevented the Rwandan genocide in 1994 because we were counting on the UN. By then, Kofi Annan of blessed memory was in charge of peacekeeping operations. But the bureaucracy, and it took too long, and Romeo Delay at a point got so frustrated. I remember the Ghanaian, Anido, who was his deputy, and right before their eyes, the genocide, occurred. If we had a standby force, I'm not sure, like an effective one for that matter. Well, the carnage that happened in the Cabo Delgado area in Mozambique would have happened. I'm not sure that the the genocide that happened in the Afar regions in Ethiopia would have happened. So we just don't need a standby force. We need an effective, efficient standby force that is able to react in real time and not wait for letters to be printed and dispatched before they move. Because timing is of the essence. And it is meant to prevent people from dying or the situation getting out of control.
Very important, Sani. Now, Matthew, 78% of all United Nations peacekeepers currently serve on the African continent, but nearly half of all uniformed peacekeepers are African. Over 60,000 uniformed personnel from 39 different African countries serve in peace operations worldwide. Matthew, does this mean that there exists a high number of African peacekeepers ready to be drafted and deployed into the African Standby Force? Or is it more complicated? Since we already have this pool of highly trained soldiers, why can't we just draft them into the African Standby Force? Or is there more to it?
Well, I think that there's a little bit more into it than just, yes, we have quite a number of experts in the peacekeeping industry. We have very good peacekeeping officers. We have the right human resource. But when it comes to the African Standby Force, I think that we need to look just beyond pooling and having this, because it has to do with a clear objective we want to achieve. And for me, I'm trying the best to be the simplest way so everybody can understand what I'm trying to say. And this is how it works. If you want to have an effective and efficient standby force operation, you will need to actually have a way of setting up the very system from each country. And having this done from each country, you need high technology to link them to the human resource that we already have on the peacekeeping. And for me, this is why I earlier on mentioned that we have the right resources. But if you don't get the right people to link these things together to work effectively, you will have, yes, 80%, 90% of our people in the peacekeeping, they are all over out there. But how do we coordinate them? How do we pull them together? Like Sani mentioned, training is critical. Of course, bringing them together does not mean that we still have the expert. We still need to put them together through a particular training that we require in line with the objective of this African Union Standby Force that we want to set up. So
yeah, because I mean, operational capabilities differ from region to region and conflict to conflict. Thank you very much, Marty. Now back to you, Sani. From 2008 until 2010, the training and capacity building cycle called Amani Africa, which means peace in Swahili, was designed to evaluate the effectiveness of this African Standby Force for an AU-mandated peace support operation, and it was conducted by the African Union in collaboration with the European Union. It climaxed in the first continental exercise called Command Post Exercise, CPX. It was held in Addis Ababa. And in May of this year, May of 2022, in Malabo, the capital of Equatorial Guinea, AU members agreed to fully operationalize the African Standby Force. My question to you, San, is this. Does this mean that the member states have resolved all the issues around ASF, and what's the latest status on the African Standby Force? Because for you to agree to operationalize and, you know, let's get this going, it shows that perhaps all the problems have been solved. Sani, can you kindly unmute your mic, please? Thank you.
Okay, so I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, yes, perfect.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I said that to a large extent, most of the problems have been resolved, but there are still some issues sticking around. Indeed, currently their headquarters is in Ethiopia. They have the logistics hub in, I think, Cameroon. Yeah. A lot of work has been done over the period, but still there's a lot more work to be done. A lot of it has to do with political commitment on the part of the various state actors. Indeed, most of them have committed, but when they get back home, like I indicated, there are some, driving forces that makes the standby force almost look not too relevant like the other issues they are contending with,
Permanently on
particularly
standby.
at this time when many countries are reeling from the effects of COVID-19. I'm really sorry about that. My gates are open. So
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. So considering the fact that many countries are reeling from the effects of COVID-19, the Russian-Ukraine situation, they feel that there are so many other issues to take care of at home. But surely this move is a great step in the right direction. But without the right level of commitment, is going to be yet another talk with little walk. And I pray and hope we don't get there. So we need better commitment than we're currently seeing.
Okay, thank you. I would like to direct the last question to Marty, just before we wrap up, if you can, in less than a minute. The African Union's aspiration is that the African Standby Force will free the continent of the need of non-African outside forces for conflict resolution. Is this an achievable aim, or is it utopian, or is it just talk? Matthew, you need to unmute your mic, please.
Yes, sorry about that.
Okay.
So I think I didn't get the last part of your question. If you can come again, please.
I said, is this an achievable goal, the African Union Standby Force? Because the AU's aspiration is that we have a force that can, so we stop depending on outside help. Is this achievable, or is it utopian?
Well, I think that security is something that you can't say you are going to do in isolation. You definitely, yes, you may have an objective, you may want to deal with a particular periphery within a particular dimension, let's say the Africa, or let's say a continent as a whole, our continent as a whole. But it does not also necessarily mean that we are going to operate in isolation. It's the more you try to interlink, not to say you are giving your sovereignty out, but the more you try to interlink, share information to be able to, that will give the African Standby Force the ability to respond appropriately, to address issues swiftly, not to go beyond the continent of Africa, no. But of course, if we have that link, that communications, that kind of rapport in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of giving out information, in terms of knowing when and how to respond, that will indeed be achievable. And I think that a large extent will be able to help it work effectively.
I'd like to say a big thank you to both my guests from Ghana today, Marty Tuopare and Adib Sani. I say Medasi to you both, and thanks for your contributions to the program. I look forward to having you back sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. And then.
Now, from our conversation today, it is evident that African states must better leverage donor assistance to increase, then maintain the operational readiness of their force. African soldiers are the best resource to train African soldiers. African states must not allow themselves to become habitually dependent upon donor support to participate in UN or AU missions. It is in their interest to develop and sustain an indigenous capacity to generate trained and ready peacekeepers. And this is where we draw the curtains on today's edition of Secure the Continent. I'm Benga Borowa. On behalf of the team, I say a big thank you to you for being a part of the program. Goodbye.